Hi, I am making this video in order to give some tips and tricks and advice on how to help find the foundation that's ideal for you. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is how to help determine the type of foundation that's going to fit all your needs. So I have it broken down by a few different areas that'll help you decide which formula is best. So the first thing to consider is how much coverage you're looking for in your foundation. The coverage is usually in a spectrum of sheer, medium, and full coverage. Sheer meaning just sort of like a wash of color. It's often compared to wearing a pair of nylons. It, conceals the surface tone, but it's really just a wash of color. You can still see through it. You can still see freckles through it, pigmentation, things like that. The next coverage is medium. This is compared to wearing leggings, where it conceals much more than sheer, but you can still see through. It's not completely concealing everything on your face. And then the highest amount of coverage is, of course, full. Some brands even brag that they have extreme coverage or things like that. Full coverage is often compared to wearing a pair of jeans. It's solid, you can't see through it, everything is concealed essentially. Next thing to consider is the finish of the foundation. So the finish can be described as being dewy, satin, natural, or matte. Now, over the last few years, I've noticed a huge wave of people loving dewy finishes, but I think within each category of the finish, it also depends on what your skin type is like, if it's oily, dry combination, and what your preference is, if you like the skin looking really dewy and glossy, or if you like the skin looking really matte and powdery. That's kind of up to you. So dewy foundation is described as usually being reflective, wet looking, even glowy. A lot of people right now are looking to achieve that look because it kind of gives this illusion of like, oh, you're so healthy, you're so dewy, you're so youthful. So a lot of people right now are really on the hunt for dewy foundation. The next finish is categorized as satin. Now, satin to me is really hard to achieve in a foundation because if you imagine a fabric that you put on clothing that's satin, it is solid, but just in certain lighting, it has a reflective quality to it. So this foundation is described usually as luminous, slightly reflective. This is good for someone who maybe has been wearing matte foundations all their life, and maybe they just want a taste of that dewy, glowy skin without looking oily or sweaty. A satin finish can be something you want to try. Now, the next one is one of my favorites. This is called a natural finish. Natural to me usually mimics what skin looks like when it's not oily or dry. It just sort of looks soft, it looks smooth, it looks even, and it doesn't look too reflective or too powdery. It's kind of that in between. I really like natural finishes because you can manipulate them a little bit more easily. You could add a very dewy moisturizer underneath, or you could set them with a powdered foundation to make it look very matte. So natural, I think, is usually an easy formula to work with. First, the last one being a matte finish. Now, matte to me is very reminiscent of like 50s Hollywood movies. If you look at, any of those old films, if you watch those old movies, you'll see a lot of the women always excusing themselves to go to the bathroom. Oh, I just have to powder my nose. Everyone wanted an oil-free looking skin, powdered and matte. That was everything. And I think to this day, a lot of people still really enjoy that look. I think it's really practical for longevity. Sometimes a dewy, glowy satin look, those can maybe wear off earlier. They can transfer easily. They might look really youthful and beautiful, but they may not be there from the beginning of a work shift to the end of the work shift. Whereas matte, because of the property of it being more powdery, it tends to just stay put, doesn't really come off, doesn't transfer, and usually has a really great longevity throughout the day. Some cons of matte foundations might be that it makes the skin look very flat. It doesn't really show curvature or dimension to the skin, so that's where you might need to add something back in, like a blush or bronzer or things like that. And sometimes if you have very dry skin naturally or maybe seasonally, a matte foundation can further emphasize dryness. It can cling to dry patches, and it may just not be as flattering as a dewier otherwise foundation. And the last main part, I should say, of finding an ideal foundation for you is considering the formulation. So the formulation of a product would be like if it's a liquid, a cream, or a powder. Those would be like the main formulations that foundations come in. Now the benefit of a liquid foundation is that, one, it's the #1 formulation that exists on the market. It's usually very sanitary because it's coming out of a pump onto your surface, and you don't need to be touching the entire contents of your product. A cream foundation, for instance, you are putting the product directly onto your skin and then putting it back away and then putting it back. So maybe sanitarily you prefer a liquid. I think also with a liquid you can control the amount of product you are putting on. You can really just put a tiny pump or a couple of pumps and measure it more easily. I also think that for storage purposes, it's very easy to put away and not worry about it, popping open and getting messy or anything like that. Now, a cream formula, these are a little bit more unusual these days. I find that a lot of makeup artists, when they are on a set or a job, they might have a collection of creams in like a palette, and that might be because it's easier to transport. It's not as likely to break and spill, things like that. Although with creams, they often expire more easily because the entire content is being exposed every use and is just going to go bad more easily. Versus a liquid, you're only using a small amount at a time, so it's going to last maybe a year, sometimes 2 years. With a cream formula, I notice people like these a lot because you can get a lot of coverage very fast. You can twist up the stick, put it on as much as you'd want, and it's a lot easier to build up on each other versus a liquid. You might need to let a layer set and then add more to it. And the last formulation I want to mention is, of course, powder. I think powder foundation is still popular, but certainly not as much as a liquid or a cream. I think a lot of people are really looking for that dewy, glowy look, and by using a powder, it just sort of defeats that entire purpose. So powder really comes in 2 formulations. You have the classic pressed form, and then you also have a loose form. Now, pros to powders is powders typically last the longest, expiration-wise. They tend to last at least 2 years. However, I think some people using the same pan with a brush dipping in, that might not be as sanitary as using a pump, things like that. I think if you have oily skin and you go to apply powder on top, the oils will get on the bristles and then they'll go back in the powder. So that's something that maybe might discourage someone from picking up a powder because things are living in the pan. And then with loose powder, I find that it's just a messy sort of formulation. A lot of people don't want to take the time to pour out an amount, buff it into their brush, and then buff it into their skin, where they could just put on a cream, blend it, and they're done. I think the pros of powder is that they can really make the skin look smooth, even, and minimize the appearance of texture, without needing multiple steps. You can just put on the powder, it's got the tint of coverage, you can build it up on itself and it won't necessarily get cakey, and it's going to last for several hours throughout the day without needing touch-up, things like that. A few other things to consider when buying a new foundation. These I think are more like bonus conditions that I don't think really influence every single buyer's mind, but I think it's something to keep in mind, and it could really help you when you're making your next foundation purchase. So the first one to think about are the ingredients in the formula. By ingredients, I mean, you know, is there anything that you are sensitive to or you're allergic to? I've met many women who know they're specifically sensitive to SPF in their foundation, so they might want to avoid that. Or maybe you know you're specifically allergic to talc or something like that. Just keeping in mind by quickly reading the back of the box or maybe online, what are the main ingredients and is that going to be sensitizing to you? Also, if you are conscious about cruelty-free status, or if the ingredient list is vegan, meaning there's no beeswax, no carmine, things like that, is that something that's a preference or a priority to you? And then for those who maybe just prefer, they might want to look at the ingredient list to see if there is any of those silicones, parabens, phthalates, mica, and that talc again. Sometimes people are sensitive to it, and sometimes people just don't want them in their ingredients anywhere in their beauty routine, and that's just something to look out for. Another bonus condition for you to think about is if your foundation has any features, treatments, or actives that maybe will encourage you or discourage you to buy or not to buy. So for instance, that SPF feature again, if you are already wearing your sunscreen daily and you're not worried about adding more, maybe sunscreen is not a priority to you. But maybe you think that your sunscreen that you're putting on isn't enough and you want another little bit of coverage. You might be looking for that in your ingredients. Other treatments and actives that I've seen in some foundations would be like vitamin C, hyaluronic acid, niacinamide. Those actives I feel like are more popular now than they were maybe like 5 years ago or so. And I think that's just a preference on if you're looking for that added bonus in your foundation, or maybe you've already got it covered in your skincare routine and you want to avoid it. Totally up to you. Another feature to think about is if you're looking for an effect from your foundation. Maybe you have very oily skin and you're already wearing a mattifying primer and a mattifying moisturizer, but you want a little bit more mattifying. Aside from getting a powder, you might look for an oil-free formulation or an oil control formula. That might be better for you. On the opposite end, if you have very dry skin, you may not want anything to do with matte or oil-free. So you're going to look for something hydrating, nourishing, and really replenishing to your skin. So looking for that feature in, a call out of the formula. And the last thing I would want you to keep in mind when making a new purchase for a foundation is the brand / price range. This kind of ties back into the feature of a foundation being vegan / cruelty free. You might want to consider like the brand that you're buying from, maybe even their parent company brand. Is the brand, making ethical decisions that you agree with, that you correspond and align your life choices with? Is the brand inclusive, representing different ages, different skin types, different skin colors? Do you feel like that's a choice that you want to, buy into, that you want to support by buying from them? And something that's important to me personally is it affordable? Am I going to be able to repurchase this again in 3 months when I run out? Or 6 months, depending on how often you use it? Is this something I want to keep buying? I think aside from the coverage level, the finish, the formulation, I think if you have those determined, these other features and benefits are just up to you if you want to take the time to look into it. But I think it's worth it whenever you are making a purchase, no matter what. It's worth thinking about, more than just how does it look, but where is my money going? I think that's worth it. So now that you've decided what kind of formula you're going with, next it's time to determine how to figure out what color is right for you. So check out this next portion where I walk you through undertone, surface tone, and how to find your best match. Okay, so the next portion is going to be how to determine your actual foundation color. Now, this is probably the most challenging part, especially if you're just doing online shopping. It's really ideal to physically have a few options and swatch it on your skin to see which is going to be the most flattering on your skin. By looking online, you can get an idea of what range you might be in, but without actually seeing it on, it's going to be really difficult, essentially. Another thing to keep in mind is if your foundation coverage amount is different. For instance, if you have a very sheer wash of foundation versus a very high coverage, you can kind of get away with something a little bit more sheer because it's not going to be as pigmented. So maybe that will be good for multiple times of the year, or if your face tans easily or something like that. Versus if something has a lot of pigmentation and coverage, it's going to be very easy to spot when a foundation doesn't match you very well. Something else to think about is if you do get a color that you're not really satisfied with, if it's maybe the wrong undertone or a little bit lighter or a little bit too dark, there are ways that you can quote unquote fix it. You could invest in maybe like a concealer or something that's a little bit lighter or a little bit darker and add in a little bit into your foundation, or you can do kind of like the shading and lighting effect with concealing under the eyes and maybe bronzing or contouring around the edges of the face. By doing that, that can kind of bring some harmony to the colors. That's maybe if you are still working on a foundation that maybe you're not the same color as it used to be and you still want to utilize it. That could be a tip for you. And before we go into tones and things like that, I want to say that over time, our skin tone, our surface tone can change. I used to be, in my opinion, a lot more fair than I am now, and I used to be a lot less red than I am now as well. So a foundation that I used to wear and love maybe 5 or even 10 years ago may not be the right fit for me now, and that's okay. It's alright to adjust, alter, and update your coloring. Okay, so let's discuss undertone. It's the color that you're born with, and it's constant and rarely changes, with exceptions of maybe like health changes, illness, even like your diet can change that as well. But overall, your undertone is steady and will remain the same tone. Undertones are categorized into a few different ranges, if you will. So the first one is recognized as being a red undertone. In the beauty world, this is known as having cool undertone. Red can also be tints of red, meaning you could have a pink undertone for someone who's more fair, or maybe if you're very deep, you could have a very red undertone. The next one is known as a yellow undertone, and it's recognized as being warm. Someone who's very fair may be yellow undertone. Someone who's very deep might be having a golden or sometimes even orange undertone. Now, occasionally there will be people who have a neutral undertone, and that's when you'll have equal parts of red and yellow, and it kind of balances out, so it's not necessarily cool or warm, you're neutral. The last undertone I want to say is called olive. Now, olive is kind of in the spectrum of warm and that yellow, and it's the most rare and unusual undertone, but it does exist, and it's when your undertone isn't just yellow to orange. you almost have a little bit of blue in there, and so your undertone shows up a little bit green. This is common in people from like the Mediterranean area. Think a lot of like Italian skin. Yes. And sometimes those who have a warm undertone, who are in that yellow and golden category, can never quite find the perfect match, because it's actually because they have a green or olive undertone and they just need something a little bit different. So next I want to talk about is the surface tone. This is the color that's visible on the skin's surface that is sometimes temporary or can change throughout your lifetime. It could be considered a condition. Some examples would be rosacea, acne, acne scarring, freckles, tanning, even blushing. Those can all just be found right at the surface and can sometimes go away within a few minutes, within a few days, a few weeks, things like that. Or maybe it comes and goes throughout maybe the day or through your lifetime. The surface tone is really what makes finding a foundation match really difficult for a lot of people, because it doesn't always match the rest of your body, and that's when you want your foundation to match maybe your neck and chest and not necessarily just your face. Okay, so now that you have those different aspects in mind of, you know, considering your own skin, your undertone, your surface tone, things like that, let's talk about some ways to really figure out what you are and how to make it easier for you. So first thing I advise is to maybe pick up a white piece of paper and hold it up against yourself somehow around your face. By putting against something white, you can just really see the true tone to your skin. Whereas if you're wearing something yellow or you're wearing something red, that might sort of influence what the tone of your skin looks like. When doing this technique, I recommend having nothing on your skin, maybe wearing clothing that shows your neck and chest, and then just grabbing something pure white. Another technique people do is say, you know, you don't have anything white on you, maybe you're in like a supermarket, drugstore, Sephora, something like that, and you don't have anything white next to you. You can check the color of the veins in your body. So the easiest place is usually the wrist, just because the skin is thin, and it's easier to see the coloring of the veins. So try this, try looking down at your wrist, and you want to be in as much of natural lighting as you can. It's going to be the most true and the easiest to see. If you're in maybe synthetic lighting, yellow lighting, fluorescent lighting, that can alter how your tone looks, and you may not get as true of a read. So if you're looking at your wrist and you're looking at the colors of your veins, if you see vein tones that's kind of like a bluish, purple, or combination, most likely you have a red undertone, classified as cool. People who have this skin tone, this undertone rather, they tend to burn very easily in the sun. They tend to blush easily. They tend to have a lot of surface redness easily, even by sometimes just rubbing their face. That's just how they're born and how their skin tone looks. If you're looking at your wrist and you see a little bit more of a green color to your vein, you typically will have what's known as a yellow undertone or warm. These people tend to tan very easily in the sun. They also tend to not be affected by the surface tone very much either. They probably won't blush very easily or visibly have redness to them. And the last one is, if you see a mix of a blue and a green tone to your veins, you are most likely neutral or maybe even leaning olive undertoned. People with neutral undertone can burn and can tan very easily, or if they do get burned, maybe it'll turn into a tan. If they scratch themselves or if they blush, they may have a very faint wash of redness, but it'll tend to fade very easily. Now, for someone like me, I know that I have a very cool or red undertone. My veins show up as very blue purple. Not sure if you'll be able to see it well in this light. I do burn very easily, I blush very easily, and I scar very easily. So if I happen to get a scratch or an allergy reaction or something like that, I turn very red, very pink. So when I'm picking foundation and tone, I may not match to the actual color of my face because that's very surface and temporary often. Instead, I like to match to my neck and chest where my true undertone shows through, and it's not as affected by my surface condition that might be just temporary or right now. So when I swatch foundations on myself, I like to match something that matches my whole body and not just my face is what I'm getting at. So when you're trying to match yourself, you can, try to do that at home or wherever you're trying to match yourself. Now for this part, I'm going to demonstrate what swatching looks like on me. I have here 4 different foundations that I own, and this is just an example of what I would do if I was trying to match you to your foundation. For instance, I have 4 foundations here that are all very similar in tone. These are all in the cool tone spectrum, but a few of them have different amounts of pigmentation, so they might show off a little bit more yellow or more pink depending on how much pigmentation they are against my skin. So for example, let's say you go to a Sephora and you're able to try foundations on yourself or have someone help you. You have already figured out which foundation formula is the perfect one for you, and the next thing you want to do is you want to swatch at least 3, more if you can, of a range of colors all next to each other that start on your cheek and can work down to your neck. Once you have the swatches, you're going to gently buff them in to see how they look blended, and that way you can really get an idea of which ones are blending in you can't see and which ones are really standing out and are noticeable. So for this first one, this is a skin tint by Ilia. The coverage on this is, I would say, light to medium. This does not get very full coverage, but what I'll do is I'll start here and I'm just going to swatch it on the skin, bring it down, and then just gently blend it into the skin. And I don't need it to be perfect right now because it's just going to be for color purposes, and I'm going to let that set. The next one I'm grabbing is by the brand Beauty Blender. This is their Bounce Foundation. This one has a little bit more of a medium to full coverage, so it's going to have more pigmentation. And I'm going to do the exact same thing, just taking a little bit, starting off next to that first swatch. And right away you can tell that this one has more coverage to it because it's really noticeable. And I'm bringing it right down the neck. I'm going to gently blend. And I'm going to leave it like that. The third one I have is from the brand Arrive. This is their Skin Perfecting Tint. This is their lightest shade that they sell, and I find that on me it's just a little warm, and I think you'll be able to see that once I swatch it. I find it's important to do the swatch all the way down the neck if you have a lot of surface tone like I do, because it might look great when you have it all around the face, but then there might be a disconnect when you stop at the jawline and you see that it doesn't match the rest of your body. So this way you can find a shade that works for both your face and body and look like you're not wearing the wrong color essentially. And this last one that I have is from Kokie. This is their full cover foundation. This one I find is one of my lighter shades in the fair spectrum, and it does have quite a bit of pigmentation, so it does come off as very fair when I wear this all over. Okay, so by this point, if you're in a Sephora, an Ulta, or maybe you purchased online 3 different colors to see and then you're testing them at home, you want to make sure you're in front of natural lighting. You want to make sure you're wearing white or light clothing, and then nothing else on your face, not to interfere with your determination. Okay, so once you have your swatching on, this is where you just want to let it set for just a minute, maybe 2 minutes. Once a liquid or cream product does come into contact with like your skin and it's open from the bottle, it can do what's called as oxidizing. It's an effect where this liquid product has hit the oxygen, so to speak, and it can actually have a deepening in the color effect. Sometimes this happens with formulas throughout the day, and it could just be the way that the formula is made. It could be because the formula is mixing with the oils of your skin. It could be for a few reasons. There are a few foundations I've tried that it happens instantaneously, and those are often matte formulas, so just so you know. Okay, so now that it's been just about a minute or so, I want to get a true read of how these swatches look. For me, because I have so much surface tone redness in my face, I really want to see which one blends in best to my neck so that it's easier to perceive a one tone from my face to my body. So this first one we did from Ilia, you can see that because it was such a sheer wash of color, that you can't really see that I have anything on at all. And those formulas are really genius for when you just want to throw something on, just to kind of conceal redness, but without really looking like you have an entirely different skin tone. And the one next to it, the Beauty Blender Foundation, you can see that it stands out on my cheek, but when it's blended onto my neck, it does look pretty good. And I do like this foundation because it has that medium to full coverage, but you can kind of play around with it to make it look more natural. Moving over to the Arrive Beauty. As I was saying, this is their lightest tone, but you can tell there's so much yellow or warmth in it that it's just not a good foundation match for me. And I could probably fix it, so to speak, by adding a lighter mixing in, but I may not want to fuss with it because it might be too challenging to correct. And for this last one, this one is the Kokie one. You can see that it is still quite fair on my neck, and it looks almost gray on my face, and I think that's because there's so much of that pink or cool undertone to it that it's kind of graying out my face. And that can happen once in a while for people who have a warm complexion. If they do introduce a cool or pinky tone, it almost looks gray, which is the opposite of it looking too yellow on fair skin. And that's what I think is happening here. Although I really like the foundation formula, I notice that when I wear this, I do have to add quite a bit of blush and bronzer to make it look a little bit more warm. Now for this demonstration, I'm going to show on this side of the face what it looks like wearing that first Ilia color all over, because sometimes once you've narrowed it down, it's still important to make sure that you like the way it looks from your face to your neck. So let's do that. Okay, so for this, I'm going to be shaking up the bottle, and I'm going to be using a little sponge. You can use a brush or tool, even your fingers work. I just want to get a good read on how this looks all over the face. This formula I find is almost like a tinted oil. It has a very dewy finish, And it has a kind of like a natural, if you will, scent to it, which I think for some people they just may not care for that. You can kind of see what I was talking about with oxidizing. This portion down here that I just put on is slightly lighter than the portion I put on, just a few seconds ago. And that can happen with any formula, not necessarily just an oil or anything like that. I've noticed that if I get a color that is too deep and I can't really notice at first, the place that I notice it the most is in the car. If you've ever been in the car and you pull down the mirror and it's daylight outside, you can spot right away if you've got the right or wrong color on, which is really funny. Sometimes it's too late because you're on your way somewhere and you pull down the mirror and you look and you're like, oh, I made a big mistake. But that can be also a good thing if you go somewhere to get help getting swatched, and before you purchase anything, you can go out to your car real quick, if it's daylight at least, pull down the mirror and get a look at those stripes, and that can also be a really good tip to figure out your color. Okay, so now that I've got that layer on all over this half, I can tell that this is going to be a great color for me because it doesn't look like there's an abrupt stop and start to my neck and chest, which is what I'm looking for being a fair person with a lot of surface redness. I want it to even out the tone without necessarily looking like I have a different face from my body or like a floating head. And then even comparing this to this half, this side just looks a little bit smoother, a little bit more even, without really looking like I have a lot of product on. A couple of things I forgot to mention before. When you are trying to figure out what color to choose from, whether it's a range, tone, that kind of thing, say you have 50 shades you're looking at and you just don't know where to start, I think process of elimination can be really helpful. Knowing, okay, I'm not in the deep spectrum, I'm not in the light spectrum, I'm somewhere in the middle. Just starting from that and then working your way with undertone will help you determine where to proceed to next. I think by just trying on and seeing which one blends in best, which one stands out, that's something you just sort of figure out over time. And I know right now it's hard to go somewhere and try things, so maybe if you're ordering online, if you have the means to maybe order a couple shades, 3 shades if you can. If they sell samples, that's really great. That way you can just see how it looks on, because once you have an ounce of fluid, that could take ages to really go through. So by narrowing it down by eliminating, that can really help you too. And for closing notes, I want to say thanks for watching. I really hope that these, different things to consider help you in your process of buying a new foundation. When I worked at Sephora, there were countless people I was helping every single day looking for a new foundation. That was the #1 question I would be asked. And over time, I developed an eye for undertone, things like that. It definitely wasn't something I learned right away. It was hard to notice patterns until you just do it frequently. So when you're doing it on yourself, you know what looks good on you, you know what you feel good in. So at the end of the day, it's just making sure you feel good about yourself. And if someone else tells you it doesn't look right, don't listen to them. If you feel good, that's all that matters. And with that foundation, of course, you are beautiful just as much. Let me know if you have any other video requests, and thanks for watching.